Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar. Thank you very much for joining us today as we talk about carbon sequestration, a very topical and important subject. I'm Brian Nicholson, part of the Knowledge Exchange team at AHDB Dairy. I'm joined this afternoon by David Cotton, strategic dairy farmer. David farms near Glastonbury in Somerset. Good afternoon, David.
Good afternoon.
Sarah Bolt, Member Development Manager at Kingshay. Hello, Sarah.
Hello.
Harley Stoddart, Research Scientist at AHDB, and also I'd like to mention Harley leads on carbon footprinting. Good afternoon, Harley.
Good afternoon.
And Nick Parsons, Head of Dairy Development at AHDB.
Afternoon,
Welcome to you all. Welcome to you all. Just a bit of housekeeping to get us going. All attendees are muted. We encourage questions, so please type your questions into the question box. You can, if you, on the right of your screen is an orange arrow. If you click on that and look down, there's a white question box, and you type your question in there and send it. We'll endeavour to answer all the questions in the webinar, but if we run out of time, we will send you an email, respond to you over email. I just want to stress the questions are private to the organisers only, so we won't mention your name, so please feel free to ask the questions. We welcome them. The webinar will be recorded and available on YouTube to watch afterwards. If you're registered with Dairy Pro, please provide your farm name, postcode and Dairy Pro number in the message box to receive points. And last but not least, we welcome feedback. It helps us keep on improving our webinars and seeing what the thoughts are out there. So please fill in the feedback form at the end of the webinar. I'm going to start off this afternoon by asking David to give us an update from Bridge Farm. We last had a meeting on Bridge Farm in October last year, and I know there's been a lot going on. David, can you tell us what's been happening?
Thank you, Brian. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, as you say, October seems a long way away now, doesn't it? Certainly with all the lockdown as well. Yes, a lot's happened. Calving went really well. We finished calving everything by the second week in December, so everything was calved and done, which was great. Biggest hiccup was we've gone down with TB again, so we had an issue selling bull calves, but actually we managed to find a farm who could take 46 bull calves as an AFU unit, which was a bit of luck actually. So I didn't make much money on them, but at least I covered the cost of rearing to the point that they left. So that was that was useful and made some space for me, because I was beginning to worry I was going to run out of space. We've ended up with 182 calves to rear through for this season, so we've got more than enough Aberdeen Angus crosses as well as the black and white replacements. I think we've got 76 black and white replacements coming through as well. So everything calved well, and then we started serving. Serving went fantastically well. We finished everything now, so we will, and we've done all our PDs, so it looks like we're going to end up with 290 animals calving next autumn between the 1st of September and the 15th of November. So, and that brings a service per conception rate of 1.68 straws. So actually we've had a fantastic service period, and great credit to Steve, really. He's done most of the serving. I think I served 16 animals. I got 50% of them in calf, whereas Steve served the rest and got 67% in calf. So brilliant figures on that front, which has been great. We've had a couple of attempts at turning out this spring, but that hasn't gone very well because it keeps turning in wet. So cows are back in at the moment. I'm hoping towards the end of this week, beginning of next week, we'll turn out again. It looks like there's a bit of a high pressure building, and I'm hoping that this will be our proper turnout this time. So we have got enough silage in stock, so I'm not worried about that, but it'd be nice to, we're all looking forward to spring, really.
No, good though. It sounds like things have been going certainly according to plan, mostly. And good luck with getting them out. I had third time lucky.
Yes, I think it is.
Yeah, very good. Now I'm going to ask you now just to turn your mind to carbon. And my first question to you: when did you start paying attention to carbon on your farm, and what's been your approach and measures that you've taken to date?
Well, I think there's a couple of things here. I mean, like a lot of people, we now have to do a climate check assessment with our milk buyer. So that's been one thing I've done. And they came up with a figure of 1.092 kilos of CO2 per kilo of FPCM, whatever that might mean. But what it does mean, obviously, is that it looks like I could have a lower figure, or should aim for a lower figure. So you then start to look at what are good things on that list to help improve my carbon footprint. And then I've been looking at where I can make changes and what I can do about it, whether it's with fertilizer usage, purchased feeds, but then also looking at things like drilling techniques and what we should do about getting new crops in the ground and how often we reseed and things like that. So I've been doing, we direct drilled all our wheat this year. We sprayed off and used a Missouri drill and direct drilled straight into lay stubbles, which worked fantastically well, actually. Even though we nearly ran out of weather to do it, but we did get away with getting 60 acres in the ground. The other thing I've done, which I don't think necessarily counts against farming, but we have put more solar panels up as well, because in the whole carbon footprint and what we use, then actually solar panels still come into the contention. I just know they're not allocated against farming as such. So it's one of those areas that we have to look at. But and I think when I read that Microsoft had was it invested in a carbon sink in Australia. In other words, they were investing in Australian land or something for carbon sink. And you think, well, if the Australians can do it, and a colleague of mine up in Cumbria is doing that as well, you think, well, what can I do to actually be seen as a carbon sink rather than being carbon expenditure?
Mm-hmm. No, that's excellent. That's a very good ambition. And David, I confirm you've had a carbon audit, and on your farm, were you surprised with the results from that?
I think not necessarily. I mean, I think with a lot of these things, it highlights that the more efficient you are as a business, it tends to give you a better result. So I think that comes into it as well. I mean, the classic is calving age of heifers. So actually, the nearer you can get to 24-month calving seems to actually be a real credit on your carbon footprint, because you're using less energy to get to that point. So I think that's one thing that came out of it. I think the other thing is really then looking at fertilizer usage and making real good use of slurry. So I think that's the other area that we've possibly got to look at in the next couple of years, is maybe go to a different way of applying slurry to the ground.
Yeah, no, that's excellent points. Thank you very much. Thanks, David. Well, thanks for that introduction. And I think now we're going to go over to some poll questions. Turn for the audience to have some input. The poll questions that come up on the screen, and I'm going to ask you this, and please, can you send in your answer, and we will let you know the results. Have you tested any of your soils for soil organic carbon or soil organic matter? Yes for organic carbon, yes for organic matter, or no? Just wait a short while you're busy sending in your results, your answers. Coming in. important questions, really. I hope you think so. Right, so there's the poll results. Yes, soil organic carbon, 5%. In the middle is yes, soil organic matter, 32%, and no, 64%. Well, that's interesting. I'm just going to ask Harley. Harley, what are you surprised with that?
Hi, Brian. Yes and no. I'm not surprised that more people have tested for soil organic matter than for soil organic carbon. I think that's kind of what I'd expect. That 64% have said that they haven't tested for either, I think is a degree of surprise. But then I think, you know, there's now a legal requirement that everybody samples, you know, each field at least once every 5 years. Right. I'm not sure that's entirely well understood yet. But it also doesn't tell you what you have to sample for.
Right. Okay, well, we're going to come on to that a bit later as well. Thank you. Thanks, Harley, for that comment. Right, is there another one coming up, poll question? If yes, do you feel confident you know how to use the results? Yes, no, or sort of, but could do with some support. Answer to that, please. Get the answer now. Yes, 10%, no, 35%. Sort of here or there, sort of, could do with some more support, 55%. Thank you for participating in that poll. I think it helps shape thinking. Thank you very much. Okay, we now, I think we're going to go straight into Harley's presentation. And I'm going to hand over to Harley.
Okay, and this is where I see whether I can work the technology.
I'm sure you can.
Okay. Can you see my screen, Brian?
Yes, I can. Yeah, thank you, Harley.
Okay.
Yeah, it's up and running.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for having me here. It's a real pleasure, genuinely, to be here to talk to you and to answer as many of your questions as possible. I am Harley Stoddart, and I've been at AHDB for 10 years this summer. Might show a lack of imagination there, I'm not quite sure. But I lead on agricultural footprinting across all the sectors at AHDB. And that's largely around gases and carbon. So I've been asked today to come and talk quite specifically about understanding carbon sequestration, particularly in soils. So if you do want to talk about anything else, or do ask any questions, but that's largely what I'm going to focus on. So as I'm sure you're probably already aware, all sorts of different industries contribute to the UK's carbon and GHG emissions, and agriculture is only 10%. Okay, it's only 10%. Transport, energy, and business and residential are significantly higher than agriculture is. But it does seem to be that we are the focus for a lot of attention in this area. Now, that might be because agriculture has remained about 10% for a long time, whereas actually the transport, particularly the transport and energy sectors, and to a lesser degree the business sector, have actually reduced their contributions over time. If you think about transport, there's lots of talk about going electric, with energy, moving away from coal. And I think that, what we need to do as an agricultural industry is not just focus on reduction, but to be much more visible and audible, so people hear and see us talking about it. Just a little reminder, net zero. Okay, so quite literally, the amount of carbon emissions minus the amount of carbon captured. Okay, and that's at a farm level. So David was talking just before about solar panels. So a lot of the carbon footprinting that has gone on to date has actually been the carbon footprint of a litre of milk or a ton of wheat, and that's absolutely fine, and that's what the supply chain and the markets have wanted for a long time. But very quickly we're moving into an area where we need to know both the footprint of the litre of milk, but also the carbon balance at the farm level. So David's absolutely right. The photovoltaics, that the solar panels he might put up on his farm, make no difference to the carbon footprint of the litre of milk per se, except that the energy that's then calculated in his carbon footprinting will now be of a lower GHG impact. Okay, because essentially electricity coming from the photovoltaics will have a far smaller footprint than electricity coming from the grid, but it's not the panels themselves. Okay, the other thing to mention here is that the net zero target is a nationwide target. It is for UK PLC to achieve net zero. There is no government policy which is looking at any particular sector, and certainly not any individual farm business, to achieve net zero. That's not to say that they won't, and in fact in agriculture we've got a really opportunity for not just getting to net zero, but getting to net negative. But it's just to reinforce the point that there's no policy which is driving us towards net zero to farm level.
No, it's an important point, Harley. It clarifies for the people.
Yeah, and it's, and the reason we are looking at it is because it is about increasing efficiency. Okay, but I'll come back to that in a minute. So, okay, again, I'm sure lots of you already know this, but when we're talking about carbon, it's a shorthand for carbon dioxide, which in itself is a shorthand for carbon dioxide equivalent, and these are all shorthands for greenhouse gases. Now that equivalence, carbon dioxide equivalent, basically carbon dioxide is the lowest common denominator. It has got a global warming potential of 1. Methane is 28 times higher. Nitrous oxide is 265 times higher. So, already you can see that, particularly with regards to nitrous oxide, will go a long way. But also, a little reduction will also go a long way. This slide pretty much, says the same thing as well. They've got different global warming potentials. One of the questions I get a lot is whether the global warming potential of methane at 28 takes into account the fact that methane breaks down in the atmosphere. Well, we used GWP, what's called GWP 100, which measures over a 100-year cycle. And it's done at 100 years because it's only at that sort of time frame that you can really start to see the impacts of climate change. And with GWP 100, yes, the fact that methane breaks down after 10, 12 years is taken into account. And of course, what it breaks down into is more CO2 and water. So it has a reasonably high impact for a number of years and then drops off. If you actually measure it over only a 20-year period, the global warming potential of methane jumps up to 83 because it's having that, that more intense, for of the 20 years, a greater proportion of the time. Okay, I hope that is reasonably clear. Of the greenhouse gases from agriculture, we've got that 10% contribution to the UK emissions. Now, you might see in the press and elsewhere sometimes there's the figure of 9%, and that comes from the Committee on Climate Change, because what they do there is they subtract all the transport from agriculture, and actually that transport bit in agriculture makes it quite a neat 1%. So if you're wondering why there's a difference between 9 and 10 sometimes, it's that transport aspect.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So you can see that whilst we talk about carbon and carbon dioxide, and that actually carbon dioxide as a global warming gas is only about 8%. Methane is up there at 38%, and nitrous oxide at 54%. Just to be absolutely clear about some terminology. So the carbon store, this is the carbon that is permanently stored in the soils and vegetation present on the farm. And that word permanently is important. Mm-hmm. Carbon sequestration, and you have to forgive me, I've lost a tooth, so saying the word sequestration is getting trickier. But this is the active removal of carbon from the atmosphere and permanently locking it up, either in vegetation or soil organic carbon. And that carbon balance is that proportion of emissions to sequestration. Same thing, largely again, carbon stocks is what's already in storage. Carbon sequestration is the process of soaking up and storing more. Okay. And there's quite a lot of carbon that is stored in, for example, grass, but we don't count the carbon in the grass because that grass is soon to get eaten and processed and then released again. So there's an annualized cycle for carbon in some vegetation, whereas if you lock it up in a tree and don't cut the tree down, then it's there for a considerable amount of time.
Uh-huh.
Okay. So when emissions are larger than sequestration, you're net positive. When it's the other way, you're net negative. If they're equal, you're in balance. Okay. So where is our emissions coming from on farm? Okay. So we're getting nitrous oxide emissions from livestock grazing, from livestock housing, and largely, and the biggest amount, from the application of fertilizers. We're getting methane from enteric fermentation of the livestock, but also from the storage and use of manures as well. CO2, remember, only 8% as a proportion. That's coming from all the heat and power used, vehicles that are used, tractors that are used, and also heat and power used both in terms of storage but also housing. And there's an extra element as well, which is the embedded emissions associated with feed and bedding and fertilizers that come onto the farm. So for example, fertilizers have quite a large carbon footprint, and about half of that footprint comes from the use of the fertilizer in field, and the other half comes from the manufacture of the fertilizers. And where's the carbon being stored? It's being stored in those vegetation which is there for a long time, and the soils as well below the ground. Again, same sort of thing. That carbon balance in the soils piece is coming in from crop residues, from roots, from the application of organic amendments, mucks and manures, slurries, etc., and composts, and going onto the soil. It's coming out, and it can come out as CO2 and as methane, when we cultivate. Some of it also gets dissolved and washed out with water, and some of it is simply lost as the soil is lost as part of soil erosion. Within the soil, we've got quite a lot of microbial activity, okay? And that microbial activity, we are all carbon-based life forms. So some of the carbon in the soils is in that microbial activity, okay? And some of it is actually locked up in the mineral capacity of the soil, okay? And that's the bit which is sequestered. The microbial activity can come and go. And some typical carbon stocks And this comes from a report I can send a link to. It's quite nice. It's quite visual, and it just vulnerable soil, and obviously it's going to differ greatly depending on soil type and also where in the country you are. But an arable soil might be about 40 tons of carbon per hectare, locked up in the soil. Improved grassland, by which we mean more cuts, we mean it's having fertilizer applied to it. You're probably talking at 60 to 65 tons per hectare. And unimproved grassland, longer lays, permanent pasture, slightly less intensively utilized, not cultivated, and less fertilizer going on, you'll be up into the 80s. Okay. Heathland and peatland, you really start to jump up. 260 tons of carbon per hectare. Okay. And then that last bit with woodland. So I've put mixed woodland, but what we really mean is UK indigenous trees, i.e. not Forestry Commission, Sitka spruce plantations. But it's an interesting point because, quite often you'll see in the media, plant more trees, plant more trees. But actually, depending where you plant those trees, you're actually going to reduce the soil carbon content. For goodness sake, let's not plant trees on peatland. We're going to lose an awful lot. But even if you plant trees on, good long-term permanent pasture, you'll see the soil carbon level actually drop from that sort of mid-80s down to, those mid-60s. Albeit you'll have more carbon, so in woodlands you have roughly 57, 60, 60, let's call it 60 tons of carbon locked up in the actual body of the trees above ground. Whereas grass, it's more like about a ton. As I said, the ton of carbon in the grass, we don't count because of the annualized cycle of consumption and release, whereas the trees are knocking around for hundreds, well, up to 100 and see many hundreds of years as well. There is a ratio between soil organic matter. So for the 32% of you who've been looking at soil organic matter, you can convert that relatively easily to the amount of carbon, because 1 kilo or ton of carbon is equivalent to 1.7 tons of soil organic matter. So if you've got soil organic matter, divide by 1.7, you have your soil carbon or thereabouts. But also, 1 kilo or 1 ton of carbon in the soil is equivalent to nearly 4, let's call it 4 tons of carbon in the atmosphere. Okay, so again, being able to lock up a bit more has a considerable impact on that atmospheric carbon. And I put here, conservation management factors may increase carbon sequestration levels. Now, this is, largely aimed at more the arable sector, really. But there's lots of discussion around moving from plough-based systems to minimum tillage systems. And you may increase soil organic carbon with min-till, but my point is it's not the actual cultivation type itself. It's not the fact that you're doing minimum tillage. If you're doing minimum tillage, you will release less carbon, but you're not necessarily adding any more. But taken in the round, the actual the system where if you've got minimum till, you're actually more likely to also be using cover crops. Now, min-till and cover crops, that will increase soil organic content, and if you use cover crops and mucks and manures and slurries, that'll add again, but it's not the cultivation type itself. What we do see with soil carbon and minimum tillage is that you quite often have the same amount of carbon in the soil profile, but where the carbon has changed. So in the plough-based system, it's likely to be further down. In the minimum tillage system, it's likely to be further to the top and closer to the surface. Soil carbon is really, really important. Again, lots and lots of talk about trees, but 90% of the UK carbon stocks are locked up in the soils, okay? Loss of soil organic carbon, well, loss of topsoil, reduced soil structure, increased compaction potentially, okay? improving soil organic levels improves the physical quality, reduces erosion, also adds to your water holding capacity and your porosity, and can improve yield stability, okay, by sort of being less susceptible to other aspects. Okay, and that's largely the same slide, so I'll move on. So here we go. So if we think about, we've got the soil and we've got vegetation on top of it, okay? And in something like grass or wheat, you've got carbon being sucked out of the atmosphere, but then when that grass is harvested or eaten or utilized, you're then going to release some as well, okay? So we don't include the carbon in the grass, but as the grass grows, it will store some carbon in the soil as well. Grow anything more substantial. So if we take a small tree, for example, whilst it is absorbing carbon from the atmosphere, it is sequestering carbon into the tree itself, but also into the soil. As it gets bigger, this continues. But it will get to a point where the tree can no longer take up any more carbon, or rather there's balance in the tree. The trees only grow so big, and it's now producing as much carbon as it's taking in. And actually, it's the same for the soil as well. The soil has a finite capacity to take up carbon. Now, I'm well aware that there's a particular report that's out there and does the rounds with regards to and it suggests that you can continue adding soil organic carbon forever, and it's just not true. And it depends very much on the type of soil that you've got, and what you're growing and how you're managing it, and all sorts of things. And in grassland soils in the UK, a lot of our soils are either at or close to that peak carbon level. Now, that's not a bad thing. It just means it needs to be protected. And talking to policymakers, we know that people are going to be rewarded for what they've got, as well as what else they can absorb. What we are going to try and avoid is any situations where you get that soil loss. If it's not protected, then obviously we're going to see the carbon go back up into the atmosphere as carbon loss. Okay, so if we actually want to absorb and soak up and store more carbon, then what can we do? Okay, so increase the breadth, height, and length of hedgerows. Increase the number of trees on the farm, so long as you're not sticking them on high carbon soils. And increase soil organic carbon levels by using cover crops and by using mucks and slurries and manures. Increasing or maintaining soil organic matter and thereby soil organic carbon is always good. Okay, a small change can have a large effect on the biology and the physical properties of the soil. So include the workability of the soil, as we mentioned before, the porosity, the water holding capacity, the biological activity. Okay, but it doesn't guarantee that yields are going to go up. But it's quite likely that if you manage the soils better, your crop yields are going to increase as well. But is that specifically because there's more carbon? No, but it's because more carbon and more soil organic matter go along with greater resilience to weather. That's increased and improved biological activity, decreased erosion, and I really like this one as well. Increased number of work days. You can literally get on the land for longer. And if you've sorted out your soil management and you've got that well, then it means that you shouldn't, well, in theory, you shouldn't need quite as much nutrients applying in order to get the crop quantity and quality that you're after. And that can save fertilizer. And as we know, fertilizer, particularly the nitrogen, has a really big footprint. So even a modest reduction has quite a significant impact on reducing the footprint. But I do put a note of caution at the bottom here. We need, as an industry, we need to be careful about overselling the climate benefits of our soil organic carbon. Okay, we do see the highest, if you've got the capacity to sequester more carbon, you see the, the greatest increase at the beginning. Like the trees, eventually it tails off. And particularly, both in trees, hedgerows, and soils, the amount of carbon you can get in there is finite. Now, I'll finish off with a separate point. I spend all my time doing the number crunchings and the calculations for carbons and GHGs. But I don't actually want I don't want our industry to worry about carbon. What I want is for people to focus on profitability, not even necessarily productivity, but profitability. Because as profitability increases, we also see that carbon footprint decreases. Because resource use efficiency, being the best that we can, only using the fertilizer that we need, managing everything, having that focus on detail, that resource use efficiency is the common driver to both economic and environmental sustainability. And importantly, the economic sustainability has to be there first in place. Now, I think that's me. Back to you, Brian, I think.
Yeah, thank you, Harley. That's a very, very good information and overview. I'm going to ask a couple of questions before I hand over to Sarah. Does soil organic matter level off? Question, or we have permanent pasture at 7% as an average across the farm.
Mm-hmm.
We have gained 1%.
Okay, so soil organic matter will level off, because you just can't keep adding more and more and more. 7%, that's better than 6 or 5 or 4. But I would thought, without knowing what the soil type is like, where it is or how it's managed, I can't really comment on how much higher it could be. But I would guess that it could still go higher if it's all grassland soils. Right.
And another question: if soil organic matter is increased by 1%, mm-hmm. how many additional tons of carbon could be sequestrated per hectare? So what increase by 1%?
Yeah, again, I appreciate the simplicity of the question. The answer is not quite so straightforward, because it also depends on all sorts of things like bulk density of the soil, what the stone content of the soil is as well. Yeah, sorry, I can't give you a straight answer to that question.
Okay, righto. Okay, thanks, Harley. Look, we've got going to come back to questions and keep them rolling in. I'm going to now hand over to Sarah from Kingshay. Sarah's to tell us about the carbon project and the results, and from David's farm as well. Over to you, Sarah.
Hello, everybody, and thank you, Brian. I'm Sarah Bolt, and I just wanted to give you a brief introduction. I've worked for Kingshay for almost 4 years, where I'm responsible for most of the technical information that's delivered by Kingshay. And
Sarah, sorry to interrupt. We can't see you on screen.
Is that better? Can you see me now?
That's it. Yeah. Okay.
My apologies. My apologies.
Okay.
So today I want to tell you all about Kingshay's Soil Organic Carbon Research Project, of which David was a part of. I guess realistically, sort of first I want to say, well, why did we go and look at soil carbon in the first place? So a year ago, prompted by net zero targets by the government and the NFU, I set about looking to write a technical publication for Kingshay farmer members to help them to be able to understand a bit more about soil carbon and how to perhaps capture a bit more carbon in their grassland soils. And the potential of grassland soils is huge, with over 40% of the agricultural land in the UK under permanent pasture, with another 6% under short-term grass lays. And as highlighted by both DEFRA and the NFU, I came to realise that the information wasn't out there to be able to tell the Kingshay members about soil organic carbon. So in true Kingshay style, I set about researching it for ourselves. So the aim of our project was really to understand a bit more about the current soil organic carbon levels of agricultural grasslands across the UK, to gain a better insight into the carbon sequestration potential associated with different soil types. We heard from Harley there that the type of soil is really key to how much carbon can be held within that soil. And we really wanted to then investigate grassland and soil management practices that may actually influence your soil organic carbon levels, so that actually as farmers you may be able to do something different to be able to actually capture a little bit more carbon. So 100 dairy farmers from across England, Scotland and Wales were all recruited onto our project. You can see sort of scattered across the map there. And each farmer was asked to take a soil sample from one of their grassland fields. We gave them information on how best to take that sample and what depth, etc. And we also asked them to complete a form about their farm and about the field and what had happened to that field over the last 12 months and going back a little bit further, sort of for reseeds and the like. So what did we find? Soil organic carbon across those 100 fields ranged from a low 1.2% to a huge 10.5%, with the average at about 4.2. And as we heard from Harley, soil carbon is held stable within the clay particles within the soil. And as can be expected, we actually found, therefore, that positive correlation between the amount of clay within the soil and the soil organic carbon. So taking that concept just a little further, you can actually calculate your soil carbon to clay ratio, and that will actually help you to evaluate what the optimal soil organic carbon for your particular soil texture is. And this idea was put forward in a piece of research by Prout and his colleagues that was published only last year. So it's really quite a new concept to be thinking about as to the potential of your soils to actually hold that clay. So we can see that from these graphs here that actually more carbon was stored within permanent pasture than the grasslands. Sorry, I should go on to say that sort of looking at these ratios, if you divide your soil organic carbon by your clay, you get that ratio. And Prout went on to categorize these soils as sort of very good, moderate or degraded when looking at the amount of carbon within those soils. So we did the same with the soils that we had from this project and put them into graphical form here. So we can see here that, you know, as I say, that more soils were classified as degraded under those grass lays than permanent pasture. And interestingly, the Kingshay data set had less degraded soils overall than the national comparison. And 87% of these soils under permanent pasture were actually categorised as good or very good, which we felt was really quite positive. So going to look further at our results, you know, we heard from Harley about all of the benefits of carbon within the soil. So what can we actually do to try and to improve our carbon within the soils? So we firstly looked at cropping. Does the cropping influence soil organic carbon? So bear in mind, all of these soil samples were taken under grassland, but of various terms. So interestingly, or as would be expected, the carbon was higher under permanent pasture compared to the shorter term grass lays, and the longer the lay duration, the higher the average carbon. So even a shorter term lay, the longer term it was, so a 1 year lay had less carbon than a 2 to 3 year lay or a 5 year lay, and sort of building up to that permanent pasture. Interestingly, we looked at previous cropping as well. So even if that was sort of a longer term lay, we asked what was the previous cropping. And certainly the previous cropping did influence that soil organic carbon. And as would be expected, anything that was permanent pasture obviously had the highest carbon, but having the arable actually had the most negative effect on that soil carbon. You know, sort of thinking about what that Harley was explaining, it's actually when we're releasing carbon from those soils when we're actually cultivating. And we can see that even a shorter term lay into another shorter term lay wasn't so detrimental as an arable soil. And the soils had a higher soil organic carbon depending on how long ago they'd been reseeded, which is perhaps what you'd expect tying in with those permanent pastures. We also looked at the number of species within those reseeds, and whilst we didn't find any correlations between the number of species, there's some research out there that shows that carbon sequestration is significantly increased with the diversity of the sward. So the more different species you've got within that sward, the more likely you are to be able to sequester more carbon. So thinking about field operations, and we looked at how the grassland had been reseeded. On average, fields that had been ploughed had a carbon level of 3.89 compared to a slightly higher level at a one-pass cultivation, but really showing that oversowing or direct drilling was at 4.51%. So quite a lot higher, showing that sort of agreeing with what Harley was telling us, that reducing that amount of cultivation will actually keep that carbon within that soil. We looked at different grazing systems to see if there was any effect on soil organic carbon. We didn't actually find any effect, although there is suggestion from the research that the more intensive system you have, the more likely you could be building soil carbon. It's all to do with an increased biomass of grass above the soil, increases the amount of root and therefore the amount of carbon that can be released into the soils. And sort of that same theory goes with the silage as well, that actually looking at the average soil organic carbon compared to the number of silage cuts on that grassland, that actually over sort of 4 cuts had, the increasing number of cuts increased the amount of soil carbon. And interestingly, we look here and we can see on the graph there that hay, fields that were cut for hay, had an even higher soil carbon. And perhaps that goes against what we've just been saying about the more intensively managed, the higher it was, but actually hay meadows are different in that way. And we were hearing about soil equilibrium from Harley, and in a lot of cases, hay meadows have been managed in the same way for generations. And it's these stable conditions, undisturbed soils for decades, that actually preserve the soil microbes. And here that soil carbon will reach that equilibrium. It's thought that this might take up to 50 years to actually achieve this. So it's interesting that we had some of those feature within our research. So moving on to sort of nutrient applications and their influence on soil organic carbon, we found a positive correlation between the carbon and where nitrogen had been applied via manure applications. Organic manures not only add carbon directly to the soil, but the nitrogen that's supplied by them will actually promote that crop growth and therefore go back to more crop above ground, more roots, and therefore more carbon in the soil. And indeed, it's really thinking about those bulky organic manures such as FYM will actually have that biggest effect on that soil carbon. Interestingly, we actually found a negative correlation between bagged nitrogen applications and soil organic carbon. This isn't what I would have expected, and doesn't really sit with some of the other research that's out there. With all these things, when we do research, sample size, etc., all plays a part. But again, would expect that the higher the nitrogen applications, the more grass we're growing, and therefore more roots, more carbon again. And sort of thinking about systems and the like, we compared the organic carbon, looked at the difference between conventional soils and organic soils, and I would have expected that the organic soils would have had a higher soil carbon in our particular bit of research. It was just, the average was just below. We can see there very similar range across the board. And I think that we would certainly have anticipated organic soils to have had that higher soil organic carbon, just due to the likelihood of increased organic matter and the like. But interestingly, the longer the farm had been farmed organically, the higher the soil organic carbon. So it was perhaps what we would expect there. We had a look at pH and liming, and there was sort of no correlations there, and we found very little evidence within the science that allows any sort of prediction on the effect of liming on your soil organic carbon. Sort of inconclusive there, really. So thinking about David's part in all this, he supplied us with a soil sample and information about his field. The field there is Days Close, marked with the big red X on the map there. And this is an 8-acre field. David had last soil tested back in March 2011, had a slightly higher pH than would be expected for a lot of grassland soils, and very high indexes on phosphorus, potash and magnesium. We can see there it's a silty clay loam and had been in permanent pasture since 2014. It's rotationally grazed by dairy cows and had no cutting during the season prior to the sample, and had some cattle slurry and some bagged fertilizer as well. So what did we find? Interestingly, we asked farmers to tell us their soil texture, as well as testing the soil texture at the lab. And David was one of the 25% of farmers from the project that actually matched their soil texture with the texture from the lab. It was a 30% clay within David's sample, and his soil organic carbon was at 3.1. We can see from the graph there that 3.1 is just right on that bottom interquartile range. So David sat sort of comfortably with 25% of the data set underneath him and 75% above. However, looking at that with the soil soil organic carbon to clay ratio, it gave us a ratio of 1.03, which categorized this field in the good category. So I think sort of David should feel pleased that it's sat there, obviously doing well, but perhaps there could be some more that David could do to try and improve it. So thinking about then as to trying to put some figures onto it, we can use both the percentage soil organic carbon along with a bulk density of the soil to actually start looking at some carbon accounting. Now, this particular sample was only taken to a 10-centimetre soil depth. Under the Kyoto Agreement, I think that you can go up to a 30-centimetre. So that was why some of the figures that Harley gave us for how much carbon can be stored within different management systems, it was a figure far higher than this. But David's currently storing just over 29 tonnes of carbon per hectare, which is absolutely great. You know, we can put a figure on it and know where we are. So sort of thinking about sort of once we've measured, what can David do to manage his soils with carbon particularly in mind? And in the first instance, it's really thinking about managing the soils and grasslands to actually minimize those losses. He's in that good category, so he's got a good level of carbon there, so we don't want to be losing that. Equally, we can then, once we've thought about that, we can then perhaps start thinking about what we can do to increase it. But actually, with that focus on efficiency that Harley mentioned, in many cases, just following best practice for good pasture management, sort of good stocking densities, maintaining optimal pHs and nutrient status would just support and improve that grass productivity and actually positively impact on soil organic carbon. So it goes back to what Harley was saying, and just that focus on efficiency and everything he's doing will actually just also give that same focus on his carbon. And I think then if David wants to then look to see if he can try and increase his carbon, he could perhaps look to include the use of high dry matter organic manures, looking at perhaps adding some farmyard manure to improve that grass productivity, therefore improving that root mass, and therefore increasing some of those inputs of carbon into the soil. So for the rest of the farmers that are on the webinar, do you want to understand more about the carbon in your soils? And it's really quite simple, that all you need to start doing is to think about your soils, to analyse them every 3 to 5 years and get your percentage carbon, your percentage clay, and your bulk density. So it's those 3 things that you really need to concentrate on. You can then look to calculate your carbon to clay ratio and look at your total carbon as a tonnage per hectare, and you can work out then where you sit. Are you which category do you fit into? Are you good, are you very good, or are you further down the scale into the moderate or degraded soils? And then you can then start making some informed management decisions about your own grassland, to then think about how can you decrease any losses, but actually then think about, is there anything that you can do to increase those carbon inputs into the soil? So if you want to make those first steps into understanding more about your carbon, our report is available to purchase from our website, and soil analysis is also available to us at Kingshay. So it's a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but thank you for listening.
Thank you, Sarah. Some really good information there, and nice to see David's results. I'd like the others to come back on screen. I've got so many questions, and I thank everybody for sending in these questions. I'm going to fire off one for Harley. For smaller farms without room for forestry sequestration, what other initiatives can we employ aside from improved soil management?
Okay, so small farm, no land to put in, substantial amounts of woodland. I think then it probably comes down to the soil, the hedgerows, the corners. Actually, I'm quite a big fan of squaring off fields. One, to make them more manageable. Spend less time actually in the field around those awkward bits and the dodgy corners which are a funny shape. Square them off, and actually you've then spared a bit of land. Years ago I was involved in some entry crop work, and it actually showed that taking out 10% of arable land by squaring off fields left land to grow these energy crops. But interestingly, took out 10%, but the productivity only dropped by 3%, because sometimes these awkward bits take more time to farm for less return. Mm-hmm. No, sorry, I'll leave that there.
No, good, thanks. Next question. We don't count the carbon in grass because it is eaten and released again. Do we count the carbon in milk as the people consuming it release the carbon?
No, for exactly the same reason.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Although grass is grazed or cut, the plant still remains. So would that not have a positive carbon capture effect?
Yes. So as the grass grows, and as Sarah was talking about with the hay meadows as well, hay meadows tend to, the grass is longer. You often have many more species as well. Species difference can be important because of the difference in rooting below ground. Okay, so those plants which are still there and the roots below ground, they're adding to that carbon. Okay.
Thank you,
Just to add
David.
there, I think it's,
yeah, sorry,
it's things like clover within the soil as well. So legumes within the soil, within the sward will help improve that level of carbon as well.
Okay, thanks. David, one for you. What tool was used for the carbon audit? And does it offer a scenario testing so you can see impact of potential changes?
The carbon audit was done. It was the ARLA one, so I presume that they're using standardised figures. But the thing with all of this is the standardised figures that are used. So and really they were highlighting their areas where I'm efficient and where I could improve, and that was the key with it really. But I couldn't tell you the technical details on it. I imagine it's done through Alltech ECO2, I think, wasn't it, or was it Genus Promar? I can't remember.
Okay.
It's actually they have their own tool now. It's a standalone. They used to use the Alltech. It's very similar. It does work on like you say, standard assumptions and emissions factors. No tool is perfect. It's certainly not a bad one. I happen to know it doesn't allow the user to do scenarios, but that is something that's being looked at more and more. So the what if questions.
Okay, thank you. I just want to say to the audience, we've got so many questions, fantastic. It means I'm going to overrun slightly. We will be finished by 1:15, but I hope nobody will log off. But if you do have to go, it is recorded. But please try and stay with us. Let's carry on. Are we seeing an alignment of farm carbon efficiency and profitability? Who's going to answer that one? Harley.
So yes, in short, and what we tend to see is, those people who've got the greatest resource use efficiency tend to be more productive, tend to be more profitable, tend to reinvest in their business more, and tend to have the lower carbon footprints. My ambition is, through work that we're doing, not just within AHDB but across the industry, is take away that word tends, so we can actually illustrate that more efficient means more profit, means less carbon.
Right, thank you. What is the difference between soil organic carbon and soil organic matter?
Okay, 57%.
Yes.
Yeah, I know, that was the poll answer. So just somebody's asked that.
So the answer is soil organic matter is made up of all sorts of things, only some of which, about 57%, is carbon. Okay. Right. So if you think about, literally some soil in your hand, you're going to have some mineral content, all the stones and such like, and then that organic element is basically something that's died. Let's not be sad about it, but it's things that used to be alive that are no longer alive, that are breaking down, and that means that there's going to be a certain amount of carbon, but there's also going to be proteins and all sorts of other aspects in there as well.
I think in essence, really, the soil organic matter will include the soil organisms as well, so the microorganisms as well as that decaying matter. It's probably an easy way to look at it.
Okay, thank you. If we go for low residuals on our grazing platforms, are we, as recommended by AHDB, are we restricting root biomass and this carbon sequestration from the root exudates?
Right, that's a really interesting one. In my head, I see it that actually getting your good residual and then growing more grass, you're actually increasing the overall biomass and therefore your roots. And I'm sure I've seen evidence in the past that shows like a set stocked grass plant with a small amount of root versus sort of rotational or paddock grazing with much more root mass there, and therefore I think actually it's all a positive that actually going for good efficient grassland management will also mean good soil organic carbon due to that additional root.
And again, that comes in, as you say, efficiency and profitability. And again, it's getting the best production from your hectare of grass, which is the other key factor.
Yeah,
right,
absolutely.
Thank you. Harley implies that there is soil carbon max varying with soil type. To what depth is the measure, i.e. can we get more with deeper rooting?
In short, the answer is yes, you can get more with deeper rooting. The depth, I think Sarah referenced it as well. Depth, the standardized approach is you either go to 10 centimeters or typically the other measurement is down to 30 centimeters. Okay, so important when we're comparing numbers. Remind me with the question, Brian. So yes, with longer, deeper rooting. Yes, with and that the depth of measured down to is down to 30 centimeters.
Soil carbon. Soil carbon to soil type.
Yes, and again, Sarah did a great job of mentioning the Rothamsted approach, where we're now, they're looking at the amount of carbon per clay content. Okay, so if because we've got so many different soil types, you wouldn't want to be, and it's really good that policymakers have caught on to this as well. We don't want to be penalising, those really sandy loam soils, which have got so low carbon clay content anyway. You could pile organic mucks and slows into it and sort of bulk it up, and you could increase the soil organic carbon. But you'd be actually taking something which is a naturally existing low carbon soil and turning it into something which is unnaturally higher carbon soil. So that clay content part of the soil type is really important.
And I think picking up on that sort of deeper rooting as well, so thinking of things like plantains and chicories that might be more deeper rooting than grass species, they again will help build that carbon.
And of course, that also all adds to the root structure, adds to the workability of the soil porosity, creating channels for water to flow, the water capacity.
Right, thank you very much. Well, in the interest of time, I think that's where we'll stop with the questions. I just want to remind people we will answer the questions. Those that haven't been answered, we'll get answers to you. I'm going to now move on and thank you for the questions, everybody. Given what you're planning for the future, David, and this discussion and your thoughts, what is the way forward to continue down your journey with carbon reduction on your farm?
Well, I think there's a few points here, Brian, that I picked up on. One is that as individually we're not aiming for net zero, but of course if we aim for net zero, then we're part of that bigger package, which is really part of it, I suppose. And as Harley says, soil has a finite carbon take-up and carbon capacity, which means that if I need to know where I am on that. So I think probably one thing I'll be looking at now is when I do soil tests that I ask for a carbon result as well as having a P&K test done. So it looks like, yes, soil tests are going to cost more, but actually I think we're going to have to start looking at this in the interests of net zero and the future of carbon sequestration anyway. So that's going to come into it. But as has been highlighted more than once, it is focusing on profitability and best use of resources, and I think that's still going to be key all the way through. Is that can't take my foot off the gas, still got to make it work properly, and that to me is reassuring in a way that that's what we've been aiming for, and I think that's what we're heading for.
No, good. Thank you very much. I'm going to now move on to the final poll question. It's only one poll question, but I think it's important. It's coming up now, and just a very quick reply from you all when it comes up, so you can answer it. Now you've heard more about soil organic carbon, its management and carbon accounting. Do you think you will test for soil organic carbon? Yes, I'm interested to understand more about carbon in my soil, or no. Let's see how that pans out, answer-wise. The results are coming up now. Well, it's a no-brainer. Yes, I'm interested to understand more about. So there you are. It's a very topical, and it's on farmers' minds and high on the agenda. So we'll take that into account. Thank you very much. Okay, we've just got two things left to cover in this webinar, and importantly, I'm going to hand over to Nick to talk about the strategic farms. Just a very, very quick update, Nick, and then we'll finish off with one or two things at the end.
Thanks, Brian. Much appreciated. And flick on the slides, please, if you would. And thank you, everyone. That's been a brilliant conversation, and I think really reflects very well on both Kingshay and AHDB with regards to what we've offered today, because I think we will have a significant audience listening to the recording of that, I'm sure, if we can highlight how well that conversation's gone. Right, I'm going to whip through my slides. We've talked around David being one of the strategic dairy farmers, and the importance of the way that we use these strategic dairy farms in the future. We've been doing these webinars now for a year whilst we've all been locked down and under the influence of COVID, but we've reached a far bigger audience than we were on farm, but we'll move back to farm, but very much keep the webinars going as well because of the audience that we've built up. And it is the people who are involved, such as Brian, and our speakers and our strategic dairy farms that have made this a success. Thanks, Brian.
Thank you very much.
There's, if you flick the slide, thank you. There are opportunities for those who are not yet involved directly with the strategic dairy farms. We've got a number of the farms coming to end of their 3-year tenure as a strategic farm this year. And if you look at the circles on the slide, then it's highlighting areas where we are recruiting. So be more than keen for you to contact the Knowledge Exchange team or directly to myself or AHDB with regards to looking to apply to be part of this group. And I think it's going from strength to strength. We've got 22 at the moment, looking to build to 25. Thanks, Brian. So as part of the work that we're doing, we've been carbon footprinting those farms who are part of the group. So those farms who have not done any carbon footprinting before. So that work, watch out for that. That's coming in the end of March. We'll start talking about that. And also just refer you back to 2 weeks ago when we held a whole week of carbon workshops and discussion, and they're all available on that environment events archive there. The details will come through in the email as well to share, so go back and have a look at. There was five separate webinars on different areas, different topics. Thanks, Brian. And finally, just as a bit of an update, the KPI Express tool. Now, I've talked about this before, and it becomes ever more evident that the opportunity to benchmark yourself, and David made it really clear today, along with other speakers, that knowing where you are and understanding from your own perspective, your own business, your efficiency, your productivity is key. And this tool is a really easy step into benchmarking and understanding what you're doing. It will also give you the opportunity to have a look at other work and other information with regards to, once you know where you are, there's a box you can click to identify support and areas where you can then investigate your own area of that business, your business that you can try and improve. So hop onto the AHDB website, look out in the introductory page at the dairy site for the review your performance, and go and have a look. There are 9 KPIs that you can measure. You can just do one. It's literally a couple of minutes to register. From there, depending on the amount of information that you've got. David flagged the important area today with regards to the efficiency and age at first calving being so important. That's one of the simplest ones to measure. I encourage you, I implore you to go and have a look yourself. Measure where you are and see how you sit against yourself and also against other farms. And so have a look at that KPI Express tool. It's got 6 technical, like that one, 6 technical KPIs to look at, and 3 financial KPIs that you can also measure. We are looking to also improve that again by putting in environmental measures in the next few months. Thanks, Brian.
Thank you. We all have our own take-home messages from this webinar, so it leaves me to thank the audience for listening and participating. I encourage you to go onto the website and look out on social media for updates and what's coming up. There'll be links sent to various resources after the webinar. Please fill in the feedback form. And last but not least, thank you to our fine speakers today. Thank you, David, Harley, Sarah, and Nick, and thanks for participating in this webinar. Look out for the next one, and I can just wish you a good afternoon and all the best. Goodbye.
Thanks, everyone. Well done.